Her daughter joked on speakerphone. My mom's memory's so bad, she'll never notice. Lois Merrick, 77, didn't say a word. She just started writing. Every transaction, every password, every betrayal documented with librarian precision. By the time Heather made her move, the trust had already locked her out. Lois had once cataloged books for a living. Now she was cataloging consequences, and when the court asked who really remembered, her records answered loud and clear. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The laughter drifted down the hallway, casual and careless, yet it landed in Lois Merrick's chest like a stone. She had paused outside the kitchen, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the wall, still as a photograph in the quiet of her home. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and roasted squash, but the warmth of dinner couldn't cover the chill that had just settled behind her ribcage. Heather's voice, clear and confident, carried over the speakerphone. My mom's memory is so bad, she won't even notice. A burst of laughter followed, sharp, effortless, and unmistakably cruel in its ease. The women on the other end sounded like they were sharing a joke over wine and appetizers, not carving at someone's dignity. She doesn't even realize I moved her pills last week, Heather continued, her tone half laughing, half proud. I had to triple check everything. It's like babysitting with vitamins. Lois didn't react. She didn't blink, didn't sigh, didn't even shift her posture. She simply stood there, taking in the words as if she were shelving them in her mind like overdue books, each one marked, catalogued, and silently filed away. Then, with the same deliberate calm, she turned and walked to the hallway bathroom. She ran the faucet for a few seconds, flushed the toilet, and stepped out with the kind of practiced normalcy that gave no hint she'd overheard a thing. Dinner was already on the table by the time she returned, a modest plate of baked chicken, steamed carrots, and mashed potatoes with no salt. A folded napkin rested beside her fork, and her water glass was already half full, as if Heather had gone out of her way to appear helpful. I just want to make sure you're taking everything right, Heather said, nudging the pill organizer a few inches closer across the table. You took Tuesdays this morning, right? Not Mondays again? Lois glanced down at the box, and then back at her daughter, offering a patient smile. I took Tuesdays, same as every Tuesday for the last 3 years. The dosage hasn't changed. Heather's eyes flicked away for a moment, her expression tight, almost irritated by the steadiness in her mother's voice. She gave a dismissive shrug and returned to her plate. Okay, well, just checking. The food was bland and lukewarm, but Lois chewed slowly, letting the silence stretch across the table like an invisible veil. It was a silence Heather didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she mistook it for docility. That was her mistake. Lois had never mistaken quiet for weakness. The back door creaked open, letting in a draft and the sharp scent of late autumn leaves. Liam stepped inside, cheeks pink from the evening chill, and kicked off his boots without looking up. Smells like Grandma's cooking, he said, tugging off his hoodie and slinging it over the back of a chair. He leaned down and kissed Lois on the cheek. Hey you. Lois's face softened. Hey yourself. We're having steamed regrets and emotional poultry. Liam smirked and sat beside her, but his eyes moved quickly between her and Heather, clocking something in the air that didn't sit right. He leaned in just slightly, speaking so low she felt the words more than heard them. You okay, Grandma? Lois nodded, her gaze steady. I'm remembering all the right things. Later that night, after Heather had retreated to the back room she referred to as the guest space, and the house had gone still, Lois sat at her bedroom desk with a lined notepad resting beneath her palm. The lamp beside her cast a soft glow over the page as she uncapped her pen with care. She wrote, Memory log, start date, November 3rd. She paused, tapped the pen gently against the paper, then began listing small details. Her current medication dosage, refill date, last password change, the doctor's name who had last reviewed her cognitive screening, the color of the new throw pillows Heather had purchased on Lois's credit card. She included the exact quote from the hallway, word for word, Each line was deliberate, not angry, not impulsive, just clear. Lois didn't rush. Her mind moved slowly, precisely, like it always had when she used to catalog reference books at the elementary school. Facts first, feelings later. From down the hall came the faint metallic sound of a drawer opening, followed by the soft click of what might have been a measuring tape. Then silence. Heather was planning something again, remodeling, maybe. Always remodeling. Lois glanced toward the closed bedroom door, then back to the notepad. On a fresh line, she wrote, "She underestimates the quiet. That's fine. Let her." She clicked off the lamp and settled into bed without ceremony, but her mind did not follow her body into rest. It was alert, calm, and already working. The next morning brought an early frost that curled along the window panes in delicate patterns, beautiful and brittle, much like Lois's current state of mind. She stood at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, untouched. The cup warmed her fingers, but not much else. A legal pad lay open before her, beside a tidy folder labeled simply Finances. She had retrieved it from the locked file cabinet in the hall closet, where Heather rarely looked anymore. That alone was telling. With quiet precision, Lois began writing. Home value. She jotted the current Zillow estimate. Retirement savings, cross-checked with the quarterly statement she'd saved in the accordion file behind her bookshelf. Life insurance still active, though she noted the policy number needed updating. The handwriting was small, neat, deliberate. This wasn't just record keeping, this was reclamation. She moved next to the credit card statements, joint ones, the kind she hadn't paid much attention to until last week. Heather had insisted on setting them up to help with groceries after Lois's brief bout of pneumonia the year before. It had seemed practical at the time. Now it felt like a thread worth tugging. Scrolling through the online ledger on her tablet, Lois tapped and enlarged each entry slowly. The first few charges were predictable. Pharmacy, gas station, a grocery run that matched her own receipt. But as she scrolled further, her brow creased. There were home improvement stores, more than one, and then a $4,090 charge from Northview Furniture and Design. She clicked for details. The note field said guest room sofa, custom order. That charge had been approved at 9:23 a.m., on a weekday when Lois had been home, in bed, recovering from a migraine. Heather had made no mention of a purchase, not even a throw pillow. Lois reached for her pen again and wrote a single phrase on the yellow legal pad, unauthorized. Then, beneath it, if questioned, let her speak first. Later that afternoon, while collecting mail from the end of the driveway, Lois saw Martin pruning his rose bushes in the yard next door. His flannel jacket was buttoned to the throat, and his garden gloves were thick with soil. He gave her a neighborly nod and leaned on his rake. "Morning, Lois," he said. "Busy little workshop back there lately. Someone building something." Lois followed his gaze to the rear side of her home, where the new curtains in the guest suite window looked freshly hung and annoyingly cheerful. "Heather's been making changes," she said evenly. Martin squinted at the structure, then at Lois. "Doesn't look like it's for you." Lois smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "It's not." Martin didn't ask anything further. He simply returned to his pruning, though she could feel his eyes linger a moment longer than necessary. Back inside, Lois returned to her desk and opened her email. She didn't trust the phone. Not for this. She began drafting a message to Susan Tran. Subject line, private appointment request. Urgent. The wording was precise. She requested to meet at Susan's downtown office, asked for discretion, and included a specific question about asset protection and trust structures. It had been over a year since they'd last spoken, but Susan had always been the type to remember important clients, even the quiet ones. She paused before hitting send. Her eyes moved to the sticky note pinned above her desk, one she had scribbled months ago and forgotten to take down. It read, "A sharp mind doesn't need to shout." She tapped the edge of the desk twice with her index finger, then clicked send. As the sun dipped below the edge of the backyard fence, the house fell into an uneasy hush. Heather wasn't home, likely out shopping or staging a fake social life for Instagram. The silence made Lois feel both relieved and watchful, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She closed the finance folder and returned it to its place, but not before adding one final line to the legal pad. Begin documentation trail. Assume nothing is private. The letter came folded inside an envelope, with the clinic's return address and Heather's handwriting scribbled across the front. Just routine. Thought it might help. Lois opened it at the kitchen counter, her fingers steady even as her jaw tensed slightly. Memory evaluation screening. Boise Neurological Center. Date Wednesday 10:15 a.m. No discussion, no phone call, just a time and place. Lois didn't say anything to Heather that morning. She poured her coffee, watered the houseplants by the living room window, and tucked the letter into her cardigan pocket. The sun caught on the glass panes just right, casting a soft reflection of herself, stoic, unblinking, still very much there. By the time she arrived at the clinic, the waiting room was half full. Muted beige chairs, a fake ficus tree in the corner, a low-volume talk show flickering on the mounted TV. She walked to the front desk and gave her name with calm clarity, enunciating each syllable. The receptionist glanced up, caught the spark in her eyes, and hesitated slightly before nodding. When they called her name, she rose without assistance. Her purse hung neatly from her shoulder, and in her hand was a manila folder, just a few documents, thoughtfully chosen. She didn't intend to make a scene. She intended to make an impression. The nurse practitioner was young, probably in her early 30s, with a kind smile and eyes that flicked back and forth between Lois and the iPad on her lap. All right, Ms. Merritt. We're going to go through a few short exercises, just to get a baseline. No pressure. Lois folded her hands and gave a small smile. I used to give pop quizzes for a living. I'm not allergic to tests. The nurse laughed gently and began. Simple word recall. Story sequences, drawing shapes, spelling words backward. Lois didn't rush, but she didn't falter either. She answered with clarity, asked a few sharp clarifying questions that made the nurse blink twice, and even offered a brief critique of one of the test's memory prompts. Honestly, Lois said dryly, tapping her pen against the clipboard, I'd never use that story in a classroom. Flat characters. No conflict. Not worth remembering. The nurse chuckled again, maybe trying to mask her growing discomfort with the results. When asked to list as many animals as she could in 60 seconds, Lois began alphabetically: antelope, badger, cat, deer. Then paused halfway to quip. Do you count librarians as endangered species? We're vanishing faster than the snow leopards. By the time the test ended, the nurse stood and tucked the iPad under one arm. You did well, very well. Lois raised an eyebrow. Would you say that if I had fumbled? The nurse hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. I'm not supposed to say this, but your daughter included a request. She asked the doctor to initiate power of attorney reassignment, assuming cognitive decline. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than anything in the room. Lois nodded once. No outward reaction, just a quiet, contained acknowledgement. I see, she said. She walked out of the clinic with her spine straighter than when she'd entered. By 1:30 that afternoon, she was sitting in Susan Tran's office, the familiar dark wood bookshelves and Art Deco lamp calming in their predictability. Susan hadn't changed. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the sort of woman who always noticed what others missed. Lois slid a piece of paper across the desk. We need to prepare a response, she said, and I want to put a few preventative protections in place. I'd like to discuss a trust structure too, quietly for now. Susan studied her for a moment, then nodded. It's good to see you, Lois. Let's begin. While Susan drafted preliminary documents, Lois glanced down at her own notes and added one more bullet point in the corner. She's not trying to help, she's trying to own. Back home that evening, Liam popped in after class, still carrying his backpack and an unopened energy drink. He dropped both onto the kitchen island and rifled through a drawer, looking for a spoon. Found something weird earlier, he said, mouth half full of yogurt. Heather left a folder out in the guest room, had house sketches in it. Lois looked up. Sketches? Like blueprints. There was a label. Guest suite, Airbnb potential. He made air quotes. Seriously? Lois didn't answer. She stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the yard where the back room sat bathed in amber light. She whispered more to herself than to Liam. She's trying to turn me into an extra room. It was raining when Lois returned to Susan Tran's office the following Tuesday. A steady Idaho drizzle soaked the sidewalks and glistened on the windshields outside. Inside, the warmth of the firm's walnut-paneled lobby offered a sharp contrast, orderly, composed, and designed for control. Just how Lois preferred things now. She stepped into Susan's office with an umbrella folded neatly under one arm and a canvas tote clutched in her hand. Her coat was damp, her posture straight. Susan greeted her with a nod that was equal parts respect and reassurance. "I've reviewed the first draft," she said, gesturing toward the folder already waiting on the desk. "We've made all requested revisions. Everything's enforceable, discreet, and airtight." Lois took the chair closest to the window. She pulled the tote onto her lap and withdrew a slim manila envelope. "Here's the letter for Liam. Handwritten, sealed. If anything ever happens before I get a chance to explain things in person, I want him to hear it from me. In my words, not from court filings." Susan took the envelope gently, nodding once. "I'll add it to the confidential file." The room was quiet as Lois turned her attention to the document before her. Page after page, her name appeared in clean serif font, clauses, stipulations, successor trustees. Her will was no longer vague or outdated. It was precise, forward-looking, and built like a wall, one Heather couldn't climb, tear down, or charm her way around. She flipped to the final page and signed with a pen that didn't tremble once. Susan notarized it with the same calm ritual as a priest preparing a sealed prayer. "You've just made it very clear," Susan said, her tone dry but warm, "that you're not to be underestimated." Lois smiled faintly. "Good. I'd like that to be the theme going forward." By Thursday, certified revocation letters had been sent to all relevant institutions. The bank, the brokerage account, the insurance firm, every shared access Heather once had frozen, revoked, or rerouted. It was not a hostile act. It was an administrative one. Orderly, legal, clean. She updated every password, reset every security question, and transferred digital copies of key documents to a password-protected drive. Liam, quietly and without being asked, offered to help her catalog it all into a tidy folder on her laptop, labeled Frost Family Records, organized, secured, tagged. It was the kind of acronym Lois would have admired in her library days. By Sunday morning, Heather noticed, Lois was slicing strawberries at the kitchen counter when her daughter entered in a rush, iPhone clutched in hand and irritation already etched into her features. "Mom," Heather began, waving the phone slightly, "have you changed something? I'm locked out of the brokerage account. It keeps saying access denied. I tried the recovery prompt and it said my email wasn't recognized." Lois wiped her hands on a dish towel and turned toward her calmly. "Yes. I updated my passwords, that's all." Heather stared. "Why?" Lois didn't blink. "Because they were outdated." Her voice remained even, but something in the room shifted just slightly. Heather tilted her head. "You're being paranoid," she said, her tone sharp and rising. "You're shutting me out like I'm trying to steal something." Lois took a step forward and calmly placed the bowl of strawberries in the fridge. "You asked a doctor to transfer power of attorney behind my back," she said softly. Almost conversational. "That's not something you do for someone you respect. That's something you do to someone." Heather flinched. "Just slight." "That's not what that was." "I'm not interested in a defense," Lois interrupted, still without raising her voice. "I'm interested in outcomes." Heather opened her mouth, closed it again, then scoffed and left the kitchen, muttering something under her breath that Lois didn't bother to catch. The fridge door shut with a soft click. Lois stood alone, watching the digital clock on the stove tick to 11. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the neighbor's cedar tree, and the house took on its familiar silence, Lois sat at her desk and made one final entry for the day. Date, November 12. Subject, legal reset complete. Heather's awareness rising, resistance level, likely. Response plan, stay still. Let her dig. By the following Monday, the snow had started to settle in Boise, just a thin layer soft on the sidewalks and caught in the grooves of the garden path. Lois had once tended herself. From the outside, nothing about her house suggested upheaval. Inside, however, her legacy was being restructured, quietly, thoroughly, and with no trace of hesitation. Susan Tran's conference room was a sealed vault of composure. Thick glass windows looked out onto a hushed downtown street, and the only sound was the occasional page turning or the soft tap of a pen against paper. The thick legal binder in front of Lois was heavy, not just in weight, but in meaning. Once this is signed, Susan said, adjusting her reading glasses, it all moves into the trust. No one can touch anything without triggering the protective clauses. Your house, your accounts, your policy disbursements, even your digital assets. Heather will have no standing. Lois didn't look up immediately. She was reviewing a clause underlined in blue. Any party found to engage in coercion, undue influence, or financial manipulation shall be automatically disinherited and subject to civil contest penalties. The language was dry, but the justice in it burned hot. She'll fight this, Lois said softly, not as fear, but as certainty. Susan nodded. She'll try, but she won't win. You've documented everything. Lois turned to the signature page. A notary from the firm waited silently in the corner, her presence barely acknowledged, but Susan had advised Lois to bring one other witness, someone neutral yet credible, someone who had seen things for themselves. So Martin had arrived in his best flannel button-down and church jacket, hat politely in hand. He'd said very little when he stepped in, just offered Susan a nod, and Lois a knowing glance that spoke more than words. I'm here if you need me to say what I've seen. Martin offered, signing the affidavit with a firm hand. She's been talked over, cornered, and managed like she's a burden. I don't like the smell of it. Lois met his eyes and smiled, not with gratitude but solidarity. You've always had good instincts, Martin. With both signatures complete and every detail reviewed line by line, Lois took the pen and signed her name across the final document. Slow, deliberate strokes. It was done. The trust had been created. Every asset, every account, every control point now moved into a single entity with Susan as backup trustee and Liam as future successor. Heather's name didn't appear once, not by accident, not by omission, but by design. Susan tapped a few keys on her encrypted laptop and uploaded the full document set to 2 secure cloud servers. One backup went to a legal archive out of state, the second to an encrypted drive which she slid across the desk. Store this wherever she won't think to look, she said. Lois nodded and slipped the drive into her coat pocket, next to her keys and a folded receipt from a grocery run. Ordinary cover for something extraordinary. Outside the office, Liam was waiting in the reception area, headphones slung around his neck and a worn paperback tucked under one arm. He stood when he saw her, unsure if he should speak or let her speak first. She took his hand and gave it a quiet squeeze. If you ever need to know how much I trust you, she said, look at the documents. Liam blinked, surprised. I'm in the... Lois's smile was small but unwavering. You've been in them for weeks. He hugged her then tightly, without needing more explanation. It wasn't about money. It was about intention, and being seen for who you are, not who someone hopes to manage. That night, Lois made a final notation in her spiral-bound notebook before placing it in the small safe beneath her bed. Date, November 18. Trust created, enforced, backed. Heather's playbook remains unchanged. Mine has just begun. On the morning of Lois Merrick's 77th birthday, the house smelled like cinnamon rolls, but not the kind Lois used to make from scratch on Saturdays. These were store-bought, reheated, and overly sweet, performative in every sense. The table was set with mismatched plates that Lois hadn't seen in years, brought out only for the illusion of warmth. Heather had placed a vase of lilies in the center, petals already starting to brown at the edges. A tray of fruit sat untouched, gleaming under the overhead light like a spread from a real estate open house. At precisely 11:00 a.m., the doorbell rang. Two of Lois's old acquaintances from her neighborhood book club stepped inside, wrapped in scarves and the hesitant warmth of people unsure whether this was a celebration or an obligation. They hugged her gently, commenting on how well she looked, how spry she seemed. Lois offered a small smile in return, thanking them with all the grace expected of someone who knew how to host, even when she hadn't been asked to. Heather ushered them in with a smile too wide to be real, gesturing like a realtor giving a tour. "Mom's doing really well, considering," she said to one of the guests. "She forgets things sometimes, names mostly, but we're working on systems. Routine really helps her." Lois, seated at the head of the table, sipped her tea and watched as her daughter narrated a version of her life that barely resembled the truth. She nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, but inside she was counting. Every exaggerated pause, every pitying glance, every comment that subtly repositioned her as a fragile artifact being maintained, rather than a woman who had just sealed her estate with the same strategic precision she'd once used to run a school library. From across the street, Martin stood at his front window with a mug of coffee in hand. He wasn't one to eavesdrop, but something about the scene drew him. The balloons, the two bright voices, the way Heather leaned into every sentence like she was auditioning for sympathy. Through the slats of his blinds, he watched Heather take center stage in a life that wasn't hers to narrate. "Mom's always been independent," she said loudly to the room, hands clasped like a saint. "But we're transitioning now, just preparing for what's next." Lois lifted her teacup again, steady and controlled. "One sip at a time," she said softly. The guests didn't catch it. Heather did. Her jaw twitched slightly before she pivoted the conversation back to the pastries. After the guests left, thanking Heather profusely and waving goodbye to Lois with the sort of well-meaning condescension reserved for aging women they didn't really know anymore, the house returned to its stillness. The only evidence of the morning's charade was the half-empty tray of fruit and a few lipstick stains on the paper napkins. Heather shut the door and exhaled, as though she'd just finished a performance. She turned to Lois with arms crossed. "You didn't even thank me." Lois stood slowly, her back straight, her voice unhurried. "I'm thanking you in ways you'll feel later." Heather scoffed. "What does that mean?" Lois tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "It means I know how hard you worked to be seen as the hero today, and I let you." Heather opened her mouth but no words came. Lois walked past her without looking back, the heels of her shoes tapping softly against the hardwood floor. Upstairs, Lois removed the brooch from her sweater and placed it gently into her jewelry box. She sat at her writing desk and opened her notebook, the one that had grown heavier with each passing week. Entry November 24, birthday completed. Public narrative preserved. Audience count 5. Witness of character Martin confirmed. Heather's strategy, image first, substance later. Response in progress. 3 days after the brunch, Lois received an email from Susan marked confidential, verified activity. She opened it with steady hands in the early quiet of the morning, long before Heather woke. Outside, frost clung to the garden beds like a veil of unfinished winter, but inside, the house was warm and silent, perfect conditions for taking inventory of betrayal. Susan's message was short, but the attachment said everything. Attached were 5 bank records, dates, vendor names. The totals had already been circled in red ink. $1,200 floral arrangements. Vendor, Heather Merrick, events. $880 catering deposit. Same vendor, $2,440 administrative retainer paid to a consulting firm registered to Heather's mailing address. Each withdrawal traced directly back to the shared account that Heather had once convinced Lois would streamline household management. There was no ambiguity, no rationalization. Heather hadn't just dipped into the funds, she had built part of her boutique event planning business on them. Lois sat at the dining room table, the documents printed and stacked in front of her. She reached for a pen, and on a clean post-it, wrote one short line in her looping cursive. "Flag all charges. Reimburse from estate balance? No." She stuck it neatly to the top page and began making a call list. By noon, the shared credit account had been formally closed. She walked into the branch in person. No appointment, no announcement, and signed the closure paperwork with quiet finality. While a young banker nervously offered coffee, she politely declined. The woman had asked, "Would you like your daughter to be notified?" And Lois had replied without hesitation, "No. She'll notice soon enough." And she did. Heather burst into the kitchen the next morning in leggings and a half-zipped hoodie, holding her phone up like it had betrayed her. "Your bank is making mistakes. None of my cards are working. I just got declined at the gas station like a criminal." Lois didn't look up from the recipe book she'd been casually leafing through. "I'm sure it'll sort itself out," she said, voice as gentle as dishwater. Heather's mouth opened, then shut. She paced for a moment, muttering about calling customer service, about needing receipts, about how nothing ever worked like it was supposed to anymore. Lois continued flipping the pages. Banana bread, chicken salad, turkey pot pie. Eventually Heather stomped back upstairs. In the quiet that followed, Lois stood, walked to the hall closet, and pulled down a lockbox. Inside was a thumb drive the size of her thumb joint, small, silver, and innocuous looking. She slid it into her laptop and began backing up everything: the bank files, Susan's affidavit, the notarized trust, the updated will. She even included a photo of the birthday brunch, downloaded from Heather's social media, with the caption, "Managing Memory with Love." The irony was acidic. Lois organized each folder into a clean directory and labeled it with a date and timestamp. Then she printed a hard copy of the most important documents and handed them to Liam when he visited that evening. "I want you to help me build a binder," she said. "Don't ask why yet. Just help me keep it in order." Liam opened the folder slowly, scanning the first few pages before looking up. Is she stealing from you?" "She's borrowing without permission," Lois said flatly, "which is a type of theft dressed as entitlement." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay, I'll set up tabs." "Color-coded?" Lois smiled. "You are my grandson." By the time he left, the binder was taking shape. Liam had added divider tabs with labels like accounts, legal, correspondence, and one simply titled narrative. When Lois saw it, she paused. "Narrative." Liam shrugged. "Just in case you ever want to explain it all your way." Lois closed the binder gently and patted the cover once. "I intend to." The Ada County Courthouse was beige and unimposing from the outside, but inside the air carried the weight of consequence. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the faint scent of coffee and copier toner clung to the walls. It was the kind of place where words mattered, and where silence could speak louder. Lois Merrick sat in the second row of the courtroom gallery beside Susan Tran, her posture composed, her coat draped neatly over her lap. On the bench beside her rested a navy blue binder with color-coded tabs, Liam's handiwork. She tapped it once with her fingertips before folding her hands in her lap. Across the aisle, Heather sat rigid, in a sharply tailored blazer that didn't quite disguise the sheen of sweat on her brow. She was flanked by a young attorney whose briefcase looked newer than his law degree. The bailiff called the case. Heather Merrick petitioning for durable power of attorney over Lois Merrick, citing progressive cognitive decline. Susan stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. We're prepared to submit both medical clearance and evidence of financial misconduct." The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a deliberate cadence, looked over the file. "Let's begin with the medical review." Heather rose, trying for warmth. "Your Honor, I'm not here to be adversarial. I love my mother. But I've seen patterns: forgetfulness, repeated questions, mood swings. She's vulnerable, and I just want to make sure her estate is managed appropriately." Susan raised a single brow but said nothing. Lois watched the courtroom without flinching, like she was observing a flawed performance in a school play, one with too much overacting and not enough substance. The judge flipped through a thin stack of pages. Dr. Carmichael's screening results indicate no signs of cognitive impairment. In fact, the patient scored well above the threshold. The report specifically notes, quote, "an alert and articulate individual capable of managing complex personal affairs." Heather's attorney leaned in, whispering rapidly. Heather's face froze, her jaw tightening with each passing second. Susan stood. If I may, Your Honor, we'd like to present supplemental evidence. A binder of organized financial records documenting over $4,500 in unauthorized use of Ms. Merrick's accounts by the petitioner, under the guise of household assistant. She placed the binder on the court clerk's table and opened it to a marked tab. Every page had been time-stamped, printed, and annotated with notations in Lois's tidy, looping handwriting. Itemized charges to Heather's business, dates that matched event flyer, vendor names linked directly to her daughter's accounts. It wasn't an accusation, it was a timeline. Lois sat still, her gaze fixed not on Heather but on the judge. Your Honor, Susan said calmly, these aren't assumptions, they're transactions. Heather stood again, voice louder now, cracking at the edges. I was helping. My mother doesn't always remember what she spends. I took initiative. She remembers more than you think, came a voice from the back. Everyone turned. Martin stood at the rear of the room, hat in hand, having slipped in unnoticed. He stepped forward calmly. I've known Lois Merrick for over 30 years. I've watched her keep to her schedule like clockwork. Garden charts, book club attendance, her daily walks. She's sharper than half the city council. The judge blinked, then nodded slowly. Noted for the record. Susan sat down. Lois didn't speak. She didn't need to. The judge closed the file, her voice low but resolute. The petition for durable power of attorney is denied. This court finds no credible evidence of cognitive decline and recognizes significant financial conflict of interest. Further, the court recommends investigation into misuse of shared accounts, per flagged banking records. Heather paled, her lips parting in disbelief. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck once, clear and final. Lois exhaled through her nose, small, precise, but enough to signal that she knew that this had only been the first public chapter. Outside the courthouse, Susan handed her the binder. You kept the receipts, she said. Lois gave a small nod. Librarians always do. The morning after the hearing, Lois sat at her desk with a legal pad in front of her and her favorite blue fountain pen uncapped beside it. Her handwriting had always been meticulous, and today was no exception. But this wasn't a to-do list or a financial ledger. This was something else, something softer, harder, more human. She titled the page, To Liam, When I'm Not There to Explain. The first few lines came slowly. She didn't want sentiment. She wanted truth. She wanted legacy, not in the monetary sense, but in the way stories outlive noise. You paid attention, she wrote. Not because you had to, but because it's who you are. That's why you're in the trust. That's why you're the one I'm writing to. Outside, the wind carried dry leaves across the porch like loose pages. Lois paused to listen, not to the wind, but to the silence it swept through. This house had kept too many secrets for too long. It was time for a different kind of record. By the end of the morning, the letter was 5 pages long. She placed it in a heavy linen envelope, sealed it, and wrote, You remembered, in neat script across the front. Then she placed it inside the same lockbox where she had once kept her high school teaching license and her husband's final tax return. At noon, Susan Tran called to confirm the filing of the amendment. It's official, she said. Heather has been legally removed as your medical proxy. The replacement designee has been updated to an independent fiduciary. You're completely protected front to back. Lois exhaled. Thank you. No, Susan said gently. Thank you for being the one who still knows the difference between silence and submission. That afternoon, Lois took a quiet tour of Cedar Grove Senior Living, a small, dignified community tucked against the edge of town. The rooms had bay windows and built-in bookshelves. The library had a working fireplace. The garden was maintained by residents who actually enjoyed tending it. When the guide asked, Will your daughter be accompanying you for the intake process? Lois simply smiled. No, she'll catch up. Eventually, by the time the sun had begun to set, casting golden light across the frost-laced trees, Lois had left a note on the kitchen table in her careful handwriting. If you ever wonder where I went, check the records. I left before you noticed. The garden shed, Heather's so-called project space, was empty by nightfall. The storage boxes, the old filing cabinet, Even the secondary laptop Lois used for scanning documents, all gone. The only thing left was an unplugged surge protector and a single blank note. When Heather arrived home and found the back gate ajar, her first instinct was irritation, but when she stepped into the shed and saw it gutted, that irritation turned to something colder. A sick, crawling quiet settled over her. The house was too still. The light on the answering machine blinked, but she ignored it. She stormed to the hallway where the filing cabinet had been. In its place was a narrow end table, with nothing on it but a coaster and a lamp. Heather's voice cracked as she called out, "Mom?" No answer. She opened the bedroom door. Bed made, books gone. Then the hallway closet binder missing. She didn't even realize she was holding her breath until it left her in one long exhale. Meanwhile, across town, Liam was sitting on his apartment floor, legs crossed, a guitar leaning forgotten against the couch behind him. A courier had dropped off a small envelope marked confidential, personal, delivered only. Inside was the note, "You remembered." He unfolded the letter. As he read, his hands tightened around the paper, equal parts grief and awe. By Tuesday morning, the smell of lemon oil polish and fresh paint replaced the usual faint trace of old paper and lavender sachets. The house had never looked more put together, neat, minimal, clean, like a page waiting to be turned. But it wasn't being prepared for guests. It was being prepared to be let go. Lois stood in the living room with her realtor, a discreet, sharp-eyed woman named Marlene, who spoke in clipped sentences and always kept her phone on silent. "I've reviewed comps in the area," Marlene said, flipping through her tablet. "With the recent updates, the square footage, and that converted back unit, I can have you in escrow by Friday if we list today." Lois didn't flinch. "No public listing," she said. "Private network only. Word of mouth. No photos online." Marlene looked up. "Understood." They shook hands like partners, not acquaintances. There was no chatter, no sentiment, just clarity. That afternoon, Martin helped carry 2 heavy boxes to the garage. One was filled with photo albums Lois had decided to leave behind, her life already preserved elsewhere. The other held kitchen tools she no longer used, each wrapped in newspaper and tucked in with the kind of care she used to reserve for family heirlooms. "Place looks different," Martin said, setting the last box down beside the recycling bin. "Cleaner, like it's holding its breath." Lois gave a soft laugh. "It is. For the first time in a long while, this house finally knows what it's waiting for." Martin glanced at her, thoughtful. "You sure you're ready to let go?" "No one asked if I wanted to stay," she said, her voice calm, but pointed. They stood in the garage for a moment, surrounded by years of selective memory, now neatly packed into anonymity. Then Martin gave her a slow nod, his loyalty unspoken but felt. By the time night fell, the house had been staged with the precision of a memory being rewritten. Throw blankets folded into tidy squares, books stacked just enough to feel lived in, but not deeply so. Family photos gone, replaced by generic landscape prints Marlene had brought with her. The only thing untouched was the shelf in Lois's bedroom, where a single hard-bound copy of To Kill a Mockingbird remained. She would take that one herself. The next morning, Heather pulled into the driveway in her SUV, distracted by a client call on speaker. Her eyes barely scanned the house until she reached the porch and froze. A white wooden sign had been staked into the lawn, small, tasteful, not loud like a yard sale or foreclosure, just clean black serif lettering that read, "For sale, by appointment only." Heather dropped her phone. She marched up the path and threw open the front door. "Mom?" The house answered with silence. It wasn't empty, it just wasn't hers. Lois, sitting at the dining table with a mug of chamomile tea, looked up without alarm. "You're selling the house?" Heather demanded. "I'm transferring it," Lois said softly, "to someone who asked. Without telling me." "You assumed you'd always be told," Lois replied. "That's different." Heather moved to speak, but the doorbell rang. Marlene stepped in, clipboard in hand, wearing boots that tracked in a faint line of melted snow. "I just wanted to confirm," she said to Lois, ignoring the frozen figure of Heather nearby. "We've got an all-cash offer pending from a private buyer. You'll be in escrow by Friday." Lois gave a small nod. Thank you. Heather turned sharply. You can't just. I can, Lois said, and I already did. 3 days after the sign went up, the front door of Lois Merrick's house closed behind her for the final time. She didn't slam it. She didn't linger. She just paused at the threshold long enough to press one gloved hand against the doorframe, a quiet farewell not to the building, but to the version of herself who had stayed too long inside it. Liam waited by the car, trunk open, engine idling. The last two boxes, books and the binder, rested in the back seat. Lois climbed in slowly, easing herself into the passenger seat with the same deliberate calm she'd carried through every twist of the past month. You ready? He asked. Lois looked straight ahead. I've been ready. The cottage was 20 minutes outside town, a white, one-story rental tucked behind a grove of spruce trees, with a wrap-around porch and bird feeders that someone had thoughtfully kept filled. The landlord had waived the deposit when Susan's firm sent over her credentials. Small miracles moved quickly when paperwork did its job. By the afternoon, Liam had carried in the boxes, stocked the pantry, and even set up Lois's old tablet with her email cloud files and encrypted trust backups. She spent the next 2 hours updating her voter registration, mailing address, pharmacy profile, and healthcare provider. No forwarding instructions, just fresh data. A new map with Heather's coordinates left off entirely. Meanwhile, back at the house, Heather paced the empty dining room with her phone pressed to her ear and voicemail cutting her off at every attempt. Mom, call me. Where are you staying? This is ridiculous. You're being evasive. Lois's number now went to a polite auto response. The recipient is unavailable. Please direct legal inquiries to Tran and Associates. 3 days. That's all it took for escrow to close. On the 4th, Heather showed up at the property, only to find the locks changed and Marlene's assistant inside with painters taping trim and measuring for shutters. This is my mother's house, she said, arms crossed, tone brittle. Not anymore, the assistant said without looking up. Ownership transferred yesterday. You'll need to schedule a walkthrough with the buyer's rep. Heather stepped back like she'd been slapped. That evening, she drove straight to Cedar Grove, Susan's firm having finally let slip Lois's new address after Heather accidentally emailed from a dummy account posing as a Medicare rep. But Liam had already alerted Susan. Heather pulled up the cottage just before dusk, headlights flaring across the gravel drive. Lois was sitting on the porch in a cardigan, a teacup in her hands, the same one she'd used every morning for the last 20 years. This time, she used it like a shield. You can't keep cutting me out, Heather said, stepping out of the car, voice high, eyes wide. This is insane. I deserve to know where you live. Lois didn't move. You knew where I lived. You just assumed it would never change. Heather took a shaky step forward. You're not being rational. I'm being clear. Liam emerged from inside, phone in hand, and just behind him, a dark sedan pulled up. Susan Tran stepped out, tailored coat buttoned to the collar, envelope in hand. This is a formal cease and desist, she said, walking calmly toward Heather. Any further contact without legal clearance will constitute harassment under Idaho Civil Code. You are not her guardian. You are not her trustee. You are not entitled to this space. Heather looked at her, then at Lois, then back at Liam, searching for a face that might crack, might falter, might offer her an opening. She found none. I'm your daughter, she said quietly. You made assumptions, Lois replied. I made decisions. Susan handed Heather the envelope. Liam shut the cottage door. Lois took one last sip of tea as Heather stood in the drive, backlit by her own confusion. The cottage was quiet, as it often was in the late mornings, when the sun filtered through the trees and cast soft light across the pinwood floors. Lois sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad to the left, her tablet in front of her, and a single sheet of paper with bold type at the top. Call for submissions. National Elder Justice Forum. Theme: When They Forget That You Remember. Lois had stared at that title for 2 full minutes before clicking reply. At first the words came slowly. Her story had always lived in the margins. Quiet, private, structured, like footnotes in someone else's narrative. But now, at 77, with nothing left to protect but the truth, she began to write like she was filing the final report of a life too carefully observed. She didn't name Heather. She didn't need to. She wrote about assumptions, about the soft violence of being managed instead of heard, about how memory loss is a fear others weaponize faster than reality ever could. She titled it simply, "You Remember More Than They Think You Do." Over the course of 2 days, the article took shape. Precise sentences, clean logic, a timeline both factual and personal. She backed up every section with a document, a receipt, a photograph. It was less a confession and more a map. Still, she knew it needed a second pair of eyes. So she called Molly. Molly James had been Lois's colleague back at the school library 30 years ago, now retired, widowed and living just across the foothills. They'd kept in touch, mostly holiday cards, and the occasional long-form letter. But when Lois asked for help editing something that matters, Molly had shown up with a thermos of chai, a red pen and an open afternoon. They read it aloud, section by section. Molly made small marks, tightening a verb here, cutting a repetition there. But by the end, she set the pen down and looked at Lois, eyes glassy. "You didn't just survive her," she said softly. "You outwrote her." Lois nodded once. That was the point. She submitted the article that night. By morning it had been approved for the National Forum. By Friday it had been reshared 12,000 times. The email subject line became a tag. "When they forget that you remember," and in every comment section, seniors across the country chimed in. "This is what happened to my sister. I thought I was imagining it. I was. We are not fragile. We are just quiet." Susan called that weekend, her tone halfway between business and awe. "I've had 6 clients reference your article during consultations this week," she said. 3 used it as part of their POA disputes. 1 judge cited it in a ruling. Lois laughed softly. "So you're saying I've gone viral in the Idaho elder law scene?" Susan chuckled. "I'm saying you've changed the tone. Would you consider speaking at the state legal workshop next month? No pressure, but your words are doing things." Lois thought for a moment, then replied, "Yes, but I won't speak like a victim. I'll speak like a witness." The night before the event, Liam drove her to the hotel conference center. Dressed in a blazer for once, his hair combed neatly. In the passenger seat, Lois wore her pearl earrings, not for vanity, but because they were the last thing Heather had given her before everything unraveled. This time, they felt like armor. "You nervous?" Liam asked as he pulled into the valley lane. "Only about tripping over the microphone cord," she said. He laughed and turned to her, eyes proud. "You're not just in the documents anymore, Grandma. You're in the world." Lois smiled but said nothing. She stepped out of the car with her head high, her steps steady, the binder tucked neatly under one arm. The morning after the legal workshop, Lois sat on her screened porch with a mug of coffee, a blanket across her lap, and the crisp weight of finality settling softly over her shoulders. The speech had gone well, better than well. She'd spoken plainly, without crescendo or sentiment, and when she finished, the room had stood in something closer to silence than applause. Not because they were unmoved, but because they understood. Now came the rest of the work that didn't come with a podium. Inside, the binder lay open on the dining table, a new tab freshly added, legacy structure. It wasn't just a paper trail anymore, it was the blueprint of everything she would leave behind, in language that could not be bent, softened, or undone. She'd already called Susan. "I want to finalize the irrevocable trust," Lois had said. "And I want to build in some permanence, scholarship clauses, access protections, something that will still function when I'm no longer the one reminding everyone to read the fine print." Within days, Susan had drafted the amendments. The trust would now fund an annual scholarship in Lois's name, for students pursuing library science with a focus on archival preservation. It was modest but exacting. Applicants had to submit an annotated bibliography with their essays, Lois insisted. "People forget librarians shape what knowledge even gets remembered," she said. "Let's not fund the ones who don't know how footnotes work." Susan didn't argue. That same week, Lois pulled out a small leather journal she hadn't touched since her husband's funeral. She began filling its final pages, not with grief, but with instruction. The lessons that had crystallized only through conflict. phrases that mattered, dates that counted, the difference between silence and erasure. She paperclipped receipts into its pages. Ones Heather had once called boring clutter. Now they were evidence, frozen in ink and time, not for vengeance, for context. One afternoon, she left the journal open on the table while Liam recorded a voice memo from across the room. "You sure about this?" he asked. "These stories, they're yours." "They were," Lois said. "Now they belong to whoever needs them next." They recorded for 3 days straight, Lois's voice, even measured, describing everything from her first suspicion to the final filing. Liam edited it down to a 6-part series he planned to pitch to public radio under the title Memory Managed. In the middle of all this, an email arrived, subject line, "Can we talk?" It was from Heather. Lois opened. No preamble, just 4 sentences. "I've made mistakes, but I'm still your daughter. You don't owe me forgiveness, but you owe me a conversation. Please, Mom, just one." Lois read it twice. Her expression didn't change. Then she clicked forward, addressed it to Susan, and typed one word above the thread: "Logged." She didn't delete it. She didn't respond. She opened her handwritten journal, turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Some apologies are written for the record. Some are written to rewrite it. Know the difference." Then she tucked the journal into the fireproof safe beneath her bed, alongside her wedding ring, the trust binder, and the USB drive Liam had duplicated twice. That night, as rain tapped gently on the cottage roof and the world outside slipped into darkness, Lois lay awake for a moment, listening. No footsteps overhead, no doors opening uninvited, no voices calling her name from another room, just stillness. The kind earned, not given. It was a quiet Thursday when Lois wrapped a slim envelope in brown butcher paper and addressed it to Susan Tran's office, care of her personal assistant. Inside was no letter, no check, no formal document, just a bookmark. It had been handmade, laminated with a soft matte seal. Pressed within the clear plastic was her very first librarian ID card, issued in 1972. The edges were worn, her maiden name typed in neat black caps above a photo of her in horn-rimmed glasses. "Too serious for 24. Across the top, in Lois's handwriting, was a single line, file under "things that lasted longer than they were supposed to." She sent it without ceremony. Later that day, she sat at her writing desk and did something she hadn't done in decades. She wrote a letter to herself, not for the lawyers, not for Liam, just for her. A page folded once and tucked into the back of her journal. "You saw it coming, and you acted anyway. You did not wait for permission to name harm. You did not ask for consensus before stepping out of the frame. You remembered." She read it twice, then slid it into the cloth pocket inside her book tote, and left it there, not as proof but as ballast. That evening, Liam brought her a cup of lavender chamomile and a slice of almond biscotti from the co-op down the road. The light had turned golden at the edges of the window panes, the kind of light that softened even the hardest outlines. "You finished the edits?" he asked, nodding toward the desk. She nodded. "Final punctuation, even the Oxford commas." Liam chuckled and set the tea on her coaster. "Some traditions are worth keeping." Outside, the trees swayed slightly, and a soft wind moved through the porch screens. Lois reached for the novel she'd been saving for this exact kind of hour, a thick, character-driven, historical with no romance subplot, and an annotated appendix. She turned the first page like a ritual. It was the first book she'd started since the trial, since the move, since the last echo of Heather's voice had faded from the hallway of her mind. Halfway through the first chapter, a shadow passed the porch railing. She looked up to see a man in a fleece vest and gardening gloves walking his terrier past the front gate. He paused when he saw her. "You're the one who wrote that elder justice piece, right?" he asked, voice hesitant but kind. "When they forget that you remember." Lois set her book down, smiled gently. "That's me." He nodded, offering a thumbs up before continuing down the road. "It helped my aunt, just thought you should know." She watched him go, the terrier's leash bouncing slightly as they disappeared behind the row of hydrangeas. When she sat back in her chair, the wind lifted the corner of her bookmark. She placed her hand over it. Then softly, more to herself than anyone else, she said, "That's me, the forgetful one." And then she turned the page. The auditorium was modest, a community college event center, with folding chairs arranged in deliberate rows and a collapsible podium at the front. But someone had taken the time to hang string lights across the back curtain and place a vase of fresh tulips near the stage edge. It wasn't grand, it was careful, which was exactly right. Lois sat in the front row, her shoulders wrapped in a soft wool shawl, a slim leather planner resting in her lap. She kept flipping it open, not to check the schedule, but to anchor herself. It had been years since she'd spoken in front of an audience, without a legal record or legal risk involved. But this wasn't about risk. This was about record. The moderator tapped the microphone, welcomed the crowd, and announced the inaugural recipient of the Lois Merrick Memorial Librarian Scholarship. Even though Lois was very much alive, seated 5 feet away, smiling like someone who had been misfiled under retired, and quietly reshelved herself under in circulation. The crowd applauded politely as the recipient, a quiet young woman named Bree, with ink-stained fingers and thick glasses, took the stage and thanked everyone in a nervous voice. Then the moderator turned to Lois. "And now, the donor herself has a few words." Lois rose slowly, not frail, intentional. She walked to the podium, unfolded a piece of thick stationery, and placed it squarely in front of her. She didn't need to clear her throat. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "For every woman who has been told she's confused when she's just quiet." She paused, letting the room catch its breath. "For every conversation redirected around her, instead of through her. For every signature doubted. Every instinct dismissed. Every sentence she waited too long to finish, because she wasn't sure if it was safe to speak it aloud. This scholarship is for you." Several people in the audience lowered their heads, not in shame but in recognition. "I used to file things for a living," Lois continued, "and I still do, in a way. But these days I'm less interested in where things go, more interested in what gets remembered. And by whom." She looked out at the crowd. At Bree, at Liam, in the second row, his phone tucked away, his expression lit with quiet awe. "You don't have to be loud to be right," Lois finished, "but sometimes you do have to write it down." She folded the speech. No dramatic closing line, no thank you wave, just a small nod and a return to her seat. The applause started gently, then swelled. It wasn't the clapping of polite support. It was the sound of people standing up for something that deserved to be stood up for. Liam leaned toward her during the standing ovation, voice low. "You didn't just remember, Grandma. You outmaneuvered." Lois didn't reply. She opened her planner, adjusted one sticky note on the inside flap, and tucked a receipt into the back pocket. It wasn't for bookkeeping. It was just her way of saying yes, this mattered. Outside, the sky had already begun its descent into amber. Lois walked slowly through the parking lot, heels quiet against the asphalt, Liam trailing just behind her. At the car, she stopped, looked back once at the building, its lights humming through the windows like something alive. She exhaled through her nose, then she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her keys and unlocked the car door without hesitation. She got in, shut the door, and spoke aloud. Not to Liam, not to the building, but to no one in particular. "They thought I'd forget the details," she said. Then smiled. "So I made the details remember me."